Okay, so I'm with Jack Marwood, who is the writer of the Icing on the Cake blog, and he's there with his cat, who we can just hear in the background, which is very nice. We might get some feline contributions a little bit later. Um, and I wanted to talk to Jack about a couple of his recent blog posts. He's been writing about grammar schools and selective schools, and so this is a Thursday night chit chat over the phone, just to see what's what. So I'll let Jack introduce himself. Jack, can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Jack Marwood, at least my pseudonym is. I work in primary education, and I've worked in primary schools for 10, 15 years now. I started writing about education about 3 years ago now. I started a blog, and then I've written various things for Schools Week, TES, The Guardian, and I appear occasionally at educational conferences these days, mainly talking just about my experiences of education. I do quite a lot about numbers and data. But I've taken an interest of late in the grammar schools debate because it's obviously become a live issue for us all. So I've had some contributions to that.
Mm-hmm. And so recently you've been writing some blog posts. You've had a few interactions with Peter Hitchens, who has been making, I think, the case for saying that grammar schools should be allowed because they would be. There's a problem at the moment with middle class parents buying up houses near schools so they can get into the good schools, and all the good schools basically have for sale signs around them, and the housing market is dictating who gets to go to which schools. I effectively am paraphrasing his remarks. So Peter, if you're listening, if I've got this argument slightly wrong, I do apologise. Please ring in, and we'll have you on to make your case. But Jack. Jack, you took this argument on. You go for it. You tell me what your response was.
I did. I picked up a conversation with Peter Hitchens where he was saying that he was basically arguing that we lack academically good schools which are open to children whose parents aren't rich. So that was his argument, and I thought this was an interesting thing to say. So I kind of picked him up on that and said, "But that's I don't think that that's true." And so I had a long debate with him on Twitter, which I ended up blogging about. We responded a bit. He put some bits on Mail on Sunday website about it. But basically, his argument is that if you want to get into a good school, you need to buy a house next to that school, and that's a bad thing. And he argues that selection by wealth is a bad thing, and that selection by ability is better. And I thought this was an interesting point because it began to ring bells. So when I was writing something about it, I looked into this, and it turned out that Theresa May had said pretty much the same thing when she was talking about grammar schools. She was saying that we've had selection by house price, selection by wealth for too long, which is basically Peter Hitchens' phrase. So I looked into it. It turns out that Peter Hitchens wrote a piece for Civitas in 2015, and he wrote a piece in a book in a long pamphlet about grammar schools and selective education, where he basically said, why is selection by wealth better than selection by ability? Now, again, when you listen to those two phrases, the thing that annoyed me to start with was that he was equating the two, suggesting they were two sides of the same coin. And that I don't think is the case, because I think that selection by ability is clearly something that's done by schools in a selective system. So grammar schools, you clearly have to take some kind of 11 plus or whatever test, and then schools select by ability. But selection by wealth, which Peter Hitchens will still argue, and we had a good long discussion about it, he argues that the schools are selecting by wealth. And his argument is along the lines that a shop like Harrods selects its customers by wealth. Now, I don't think that's true. I think that what happens is that a shop like Harrods positions itself in the marketplace, and people decide whether they shop there or not. But again, I think those decisions are then made by the parents. But the shop isn't choosing who shops there, in the same way that a school isn't selecting who applies to it. So if you're in a non-selective grammar comprehensive, you're not selecting your children. Your children are that's a different thing. It's been done by the parents. It's not been done by the school. So again, that's
yeah. Go on. I was.
So that's the initial argument that I'd had with him. That I think those two things are very different. Now, it sounds like a bit of a semantic point, but it is important. You know, when we're talking about the difference between what we currently have and what we could have with the grammar school system, the two things would be very different, I think.
Mm-hmm.
They're not two sides of the same coin.
So let's just have a quick think about the Harrods analogy, because as you were saying it, I was thinking, I've been to Harrods. I've bought a pack of biscuits because I wasn't willing to spend any more money than that. So
Exactly.
Harrods does.
It has a great food hall, by the way. You should go there.
Yeah,
sometime.
no,
But again,
I've
only
seen
to buy a sandwich. You know, you're not buying a hamper.
Absolutely. So for me, maybe Harrods does price people out the market from the point of view of there will be people who might go into Harrods and buy nothing more than a packet of biscuits. They're not true shoppers at Harrods. They don't frequent it. They're not Harrods customers, even though they've had some custom, if you see what I mean. That's maybe the equivalent of saying a kid going to a grammar school playing field to go and play sports, for example. But however, I don't know that the Harrods analogy can be passed on to a school because it's not the school that's charging that money. A school is in a location. A school has a location which may have a high value housing market around it, but it doesn't have
This
to.
is the argument. That is the argument which I had with Peter Hitchens to basically say I don't think your analogy works because that's not what's happening. He put his case and he said no, there is selection by wealth. Schools select by wealth because you can only afford to live nearby. And I think it's muddying of the waters, and I think that it's a dangerous argument. And the reason why I picked it up partly was because I was trying to find anybody who'd had been actually arguing for grammar schools, and Peter Hitchens was one of the very few voices. In fact, the only kind of voice that you hear on a national stage who has been positive for them. A few, individuals have said, I think they're a good idea. But when you talk about people with some kind of platform, he has a platform and he said so, but very few other people have done. So I thought it was interesting that he was saying this. So we had this discussion about Harrods. I think, again, schooling is very different from people selling products.
Yeah,
in the open
an
market.
analogy
We're
only takes you so far.
Exactly, clearly. And I think the core thing, which I think was wrong with that analogy, is that we've chosen as a country to have a responsibility to educate everybody. Harrods only needs to sell to people who want to buy from it. It has no responsibility to anybody who doesn't shop there.
Yeah.
So I think the whole thing falls down. Yeah.
So this ties in a little bit with the interview that we broadcast last podcast with the head of Michaela, when she was describing, Catherine Birbalsingh was describing the lottery system. And actually, when she was describing the lottery system, it made me think of the sorts of things we might discuss, including selection by wealth. And if you have a lottery system, which not all schools do, but a lot do, there are lots of different ways that children can be assigned to a school. It can be by proximity, or it can be by the luck of the draw, literally a lottery.
Absolutely.
And
yes.
And so in that case, the selection of wealth argument disappears. I believe
it does, and I think it is interesting. Again, and look at the Michaela situation is that and they're a very interesting school in many ways. But Michaela, they basically draw a 5-mile radius around the school, and provided you live within that area, if you apply to the school, then everybody applies to the school. You're all put into a pot, and then they pick out enough 120 children for the school. So they have a lottery. And there are a number of places that do that. Brighton has quite a well-established lottery system. Most other places don't do that. Most other places have, you have admissions criteria, but after you've got past the ones to do with looked after children or children with special educational needs, you basically moved into proximity to the school.
Or siblings.
I mean, there are arguments for both of
yeah.
those. Exactly. The discussion which I had, again, going back to the Peter Hitchens discussion, because I had that
take
discussion
this
with
on.
him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be quiet.
So I had that initial discussion with him about selection by wealth. And again, once I made my point, and he kind of said, well, you see, but you're wrong because there clearly is selection by wealth. And then I had, having reflected on that and thought about that, I wrote another piece to say, yep, you're quite right. There is selection by wealth. And there is selection by house price. And people do buy houses to get close to schools so they can get their children into those schools. But the more I reflected on that, the more I thought, actually, I think that's a really good thing. I think it is a really good thing because the way in which we've looked at education for the last 20 odd years, 25 years, is that we've tried to provide a good education for all, and we've tried to give parents some element of choice in the school which their children go to.
Mm-hmm.
Now, people complain about the preference system that we have for primary and secondary, but actually you can express a preference. You can say, I want my child to go to this school. But more than that, you can express a preference by moving near a school which you want to put your children into.
Mm-hmm.
Most people, before they have children, don't live near schools because they're not living the kind of life which requires them to live in a suburban
You're talking to
environment.
somebody who moved
Yeah.
house before I had any children, but
Absolutely.
literally, I moved house just before my daughter was born, and one of the criteria for choosing this house was it was next to a small, good school, and it wasn't the sole reason we picked the house, but it certainly factored into it. Before I was having children, I wouldn't be worried about living near a school, but
And I think that's the case for the vast majority of people. Now, admittedly,
but
it's not all people, because there are a lot of people whose circumstances are such that they don't have that kind of choice.
yeah, they don't have the
But
choice.
even
Yeah.
then, we know that the children who move around the most within the school system, they're not the rich children.
No.
The children who move around with the school system are children who tend to be less well off. So again, this argument that it's only the rich who get the choice. Well, you don't. You can choose. If you live somewhere and you don't like where you live, you can up sticks and move. In the school which I teach in, we have children moving in from outside of the city which I teach in all the time. It happens, and people can make those decisions anyway. So the argument which I think is that if you want to, you can move, and most people do that, and I think that's a good thing, because at least you're then expressing a preference for the school, and that works in two ways. It gives the parents the benefit of having some say in where their child's going to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
And it also has the benefit of putting pressure on schools, because then schools know that they need to offer something which appeals to parents.
Mm-hmm.
Now, admittedly, the richer you are, the more choice you've got.
Yeah.
But that's the economic system under which we live. The more cash you've got, the more choice of car you've got. So it is. But most people can afford a runaround. And the more cash you've got, the more exclusive a school you can afford to do. But most people can afford a typical school. You can find an average school. Yes, some schools have super selective catchment areas based on bottom wealth, but that's probably been the case forever. If you want to go live in a really expensive bit of, I don't know, Oxford or London, they've been really expensive for a very long time. Anyway, so the second argument, which I said was, and I still think this, that there is selection by wealth. There clearly is, but I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it has to be a good thing.
And do you think it's a large amount of selection by wealth? Because this is something that I want to dig into a bit more, not necessarily in this conversation just now, but is this a large effect, or is a side effect? I don't mean I don't mean a side effect as in shooting off from it, but as in a not a major effect in the school. Or does it depend on which school? It depends. For me, it depends.
It depends on schools and depends on where you are. But I think a huge number of schools around the country, because schools tend to be in the area where the housing is.
Yeah.
And there's no reason for you to live in a 3 or 4 bedroom house with a garden, unless you've got children.
Yeah.
If you don't have children, you don't need that. You live in a flat, or you live with your parents, or you do whatever. People want to move into the type of houses that's next to a school when they're going to have children, or when they have children. So I think there's a lot of that. There's a lot of movement around.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and I think that's the interesting thing. Now, Peter Hitchens again will argue that there should be selection by ability, and that, as we all know, is that's been the interesting thing about the grammar school debate that we've had recently, because hardly anybody has argued for that, but at least he has argued for it, and he's made a very strong case that we should select by ability, because we need to, again, as he said in his initial tweet that I discussed, about the fact that there weren't academically good schools which are open to children whose parents aren't rich.
Right.
And again, I think that the worry there is that we've had 5-6 years of the current government with the Lib Dems before, arguing strongly that we should have excellent schools for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that we should move to excellent schools, however you define those, just for a few people, I think is very worrying.
It's not this is the thing. The tack has changed, definitely. The DfE have changed tack, or the government have changed tack. I think the DfE were caught out somewhat, or maybe knew it was coming, but weren't 100% sure. But the government have changed tack. They're still using similar language. They are saying good schools for all, I think, is in the in the
Exactly, by
language.
having grammar schools, which is just extraordinary.
It's just ironic because they're still using the same kind of. They want the same outcome, or they're saying they want the same outcome, but their methodology has changed. So instead of saying, well, we want all schools to become academies, which was what they were hoping would improve all schools, is they're saying, well, we want to introduce selection, and that will mean there's good schools for all. So they're basically, I think their intended outcome, stated outcome, is the same in that they want to improve schooling for everybody, but their methodology, they changed tack on how they're going to get there. Instead of sailing one direction to try and get there, they're going close to shore. They're seeing whether or not they can. Exactly. They can,
and I think it's a bit suspect. I mean, people have made all kinds of observations about, is it a dead cat maneuver where you throw a dead cat on the table to get everybody to look at that, to distract us from many other issues the country is facing.
I don't know what you mean.
So it could be that. Exactly, it could be that. And it could also be the fact that the Department of Education doesn't seem to be, as much as we can see, they're not quite as in control of the brief as they were previously, because number 10 is making decisions, for all kinds of reasons. Nick Timothy, who was part of the New Schools Network, is now a major advisor for Theresa May, and so on. So there's all those things.
The landscape, the SPAD landscape has changed.
I think the other thing is that the government is also kind of throwing something out to traditional conservative voters of saying grammar schools, we should have more of those, because we know that a lot of people think that grammar schools are a great idea.
And of course, it was one of the selling points that the UKIP party, tautology, that UKIP went for. They were saying that they wanted to bring
we should have more grammar
schools.
And a lot of people think that. A lot of people think we should have more grammar schools.
Interestingly, I will come back to your blog post and a little bit more discussion on that, but that leads us quite nicely into the tweet that was sent out by the DFE. I'll be discussing that a little bit more with Leon, but I wanted your opinion. The tweet said something along these lines.
Is this the tweet from this week? Yes,
this is this week's tweet.
There've been some doozies coming from the DFE.
I tell you what, they are
as good.
They are keeping me in business. No, right, so I love this. It's great. It's just kind of appeared, this idea that we can critique the DFE's latest statistical blunders. So
fantastic.
Anyway, their tweet says, their little picture says, selective schools are almost 50% more popular than non-selective schools. So they're saying that is when comparing a parent's first preference for their child. Okay? And they've got the statistics, they've got the link, they've got a little publication, and that's already there.
I'm going to stop you. I have to stop you there because, I'm a statistician.
Go for it.
The whole idea that that's a statistic, you're just like, no, it's just
great.
A made-up figure.
It's almost
data mining of the highest order.
Almost 50% more popular than non-selective schools when comparing. So what we're saying is the parent has looked at this list of schools.
Yep.
I'm just reading through. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt, because, and we'll tear them to pieces in a minute. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt, and we'll say, well, let's imagine we're talking about a particular parent, okay, or it's a particular set of parents in an area where there are selective schools, okay. So 50% more popular than non-selective schools for their first preference. So if you are in an area with selective schools, I'm surprised that statistic is so low, aren't you?
Exactly. But it's also, again, the problem with it is that in order for you to really understand quite how ridiculous it is, there's a whole bunch of other information you need to understand about the way which selection works and so on. And it is, so for example, if you live in Kent, which has got the most grammar schools that still exist, and if you want to apply for a grammar school, you have to take the 11 plus, which hilariously, the euphemism they use there is the Kent test. But basically, you take the 11 plus, and you do that in Kent. So loads of children take the 11 plus, and then you get a mark, and that mark tells you whether you can get into, whether you then pass the Kent test, whether you pass the 11 plus. So then you're eligible for a grammar school place, and then after that, then you have to apply for a school, for a grammar school. So lots of people, of course, do that. Your child passes the test, then you apply for the grammar school. There's about 5,000 grammar schools in Kent, or places, 5,000 grammar school places available. So then loads of people apply for those places. But you can appeal You can appeal if your child didn't pass, if they failed 11 plus. And let's say that again, because let's not beat around the bush. You failed the test. So
Yes,
if you
the
fail the
school is not
test,
selecting you this time. Yeah.
no, there's no selection by wealth here. You failed the test. So if you fail the test, and you want to appeal that and say, well, even though my child failed the test, I still think they should get a place in a grammar school. If you want to do that, then you have to name a grammar school on the form.
Right.
So you have to apply for a grammar school, even though there's no possibility of you getting in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is a very small possibility. Well, there is a
Okay.
possibility, but
So
there's not a possibility.
every
So that
single
basically that
parent should be
increases the
putting
number
that.
of people. Yeah. So that increases the number of people who apply for places in Kent. Added to which, because Kent has grammar schools and because they're super selective and because people, lay people like the idea of grammar schools, so loads of people from outside of Kent apply for schools. So there's about, again, looking at the figures, there's just over 4,000 people from Kent, children from Kent have passed the test. But there's another 2,000, two and a bit thousand people from outside of Kent who've passed the test as well, because they're allowed to take it.
Mm-hmm.
So they've taken the 11 plus. So there's something like 6,500, 7,000 children who have passed the Kent test, who the 11 plus, who apply for these 5,000 places.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's all these people who are borderline, and I don't know how many of those are. I've looked into it, but quite frankly, lifetime's too short for trying to find that out. But let's assume that there's 8,000, 9,000. I don't know. I mean, they said 50% more likely. I don't know. Maybe there's 7,500, 8,000 people apply for the 5,000 places.
Sure.
I don't know. Anyway, but either way, you're not comparing like with like. It's very, very different. Again, it's one of those things where you've just looked at a whole bunch of numbers and you've chosen one which seems to suit your argument. But if you look closely, it all falls apart.
So if I'm a parent living in Kent and my child is doing quite well at school, and I want them to go to a school, I don't mind what school, but I want to give them the opportunity of getting into the grammar school because that's the system, and so naturally I want them to do well on the 11 plus. What you're saying to me is, if they don't do well on the 11 plus and they just miss it, if I haven't selected the grammar school as my first preference, there's nothing I can do about it.
Well, no, as any of your preferences.
As any of my preferences.
The fact that the government has, that the DfE have chosen that particular thing about when comparing parents' first place preference for their child, again, you just think, honestly, you've split straws of straws that were already split.
And what we don't know is whether or not we are talking whether or not we are talking about from the tweet. I mean, I'm sure it goes into more detail in the document. Whether we're talking about this across the country, are we? What are we talking about? We've got thousands of schools that are non-selective. So are they? Are we including those stats in this, or are we just choosing this in selective areas?
Exactly.
Who knows where this number comes from?
It's, again, a lot of the writing which I do is about data misuse, and it's classic data misuse, particularly throwing out the 50% there, because you're looking at it thinking, 50% of what exactly? Again, I've just written a piece, I'm writing a book about data, data busting for schools, and I've just written about saying you need to be careful about people using percentages, because percentages can be incredibly useful.
Yeah.
But equally, in this case, we're like, well, 50% of what? What does that mean? It doesn't really. It just sounds like a big number, and that's the reason probably why they've used it.
To my mind, what it appears to be, and again, it's really difficult to say. So what we're saying is that if you've got a number of parents, let's say 10 parents, who've chosen any of the non-selective schools as their first preference, so group of parents, we'll call it 10 because it's an easy number, a group of parents who've chosen any of the other schools as their first preference. Maybe they live near them, right? What we're saying is there's 15 parents who've chosen the grammar school.
Yeah, because they will have all stuck them in dams.
So 25 parents overall, 10 of them have chosen any of the other schools as their first choice, and 15 of them have chosen to use the grammar school. That's what that stat says to me. If that statistic is just looking at the area that we're talking about, who knows?
I think that the other thing, which is also hilarious, again, because I've been having discussions with Peter Hitchens, again, the fact that again he's argued this, that selection by ability is better than selection by wealth. The thing that blew my mind when I figured this out this week is that, in Kent, again, the biggest selective council that we have, or local authority that we have, in Kent, the majority of the grammar schools, guess what? they select by house price as well.
Yeah.
because most of those grammar schools, so you can apply for the school. If you've passed the Kent test, you're eligible for the school.
But you've still
So
got to
after
live
they've
in.
gone through their criteria, it's still closest to school gets
Yeah.
in. So it's still selection by house price.
Uh-huh.
So again, if you're a parent in Kent and you think your kid's quite smart, so you've probably tutored them to death as well. So anyway, they've passed the 11 plus, and you have moved next to the grammar school which you want your child to go into. You can probably get your kid into that school.
Mm-hmm.
Your child can probably go into that school. So even in Kent, where they have selection by ability, it's selection by ability and selection by wealth. It's not one or the other. Again, admittedly, there are about a third of the schools in Kent that, for example, I'm talking about Kent because I've had a good look into it, that are super selective, where they genuinely do take, they take you in order of score in the Kent test. But they're in a minority.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the children going to grammar school in Kent are being selected by ability and selected by wealth. So for Theresa May to say it is wrong that we have selection by house price and we should instead have selection by ability is just, it's flannel of the highest order.
Yeah.
And again, you're just looking at it. And I think as most people, well, in fact, everybody except for Peter Hitchens, possibly Theresa May, and maybe a few other of the members of the government have said, the grammar school thing, it's just really not a good idea. So hopefully they'll see a bit of sense. They've U-turned on lots of stuff. So hopefully they'll look at it and say, yes, it was a dead cat. We threw it on the table. But really, it doesn't make sense.
Except in this tweet, this is the first tweet where they've been talking about what parents think and what parents want. And this comes on to the conversation that I had with a gentleman on the train. I was going down to Research Ed back in September and managed to get an upgrade to first class. Because I don't think I'd have been having this particular conversation, had I not been sat in first class. Opposite a gentleman who was interested, had seen my T-shirt. I had something on my T-shirt. I can't remember what. Some terribly progressive slogan, probably. Anyway, and he was asking where I was going, so we had the conversation. And he was asking me what I thought about the grammar schools. And I asked him as well. And his response just made me realise that there's two ways of tackling this. There's the nerdy way that we've been discussing about the fact that the stats just do not show, and they're having to be exceptionally creative with the stats in order to try and spin this in a positive way. And they show no benefit of grammar schools, and we'll come back to a point that I think you'd made and you've been looking at in a second. But that's one side of it. The other side of it is what do parents want for their kids? And this guy he said to me, look, I send my kids to private school. I've paid for their education, but if I couldn't afford to, I'd want them to go to the best school that they can do. And so he was saying, so why shouldn't we have grammar schools? Why shouldn't we kind of separate? I'm paraphrasing, these weren't his words, but separate the wheat from the chaff and allow them to be educated in a school that's going to get them further, in a school that's going to push them further, and let them shine in that scenario. Let them shine in a school that is able to do that. And if that's the case, why can't we do that for more kids? Why shouldn't that be across the country where that is an option for kids? And
I think that he's putting. Yeah.
I was just going to say, when you consider that from a parent's point of view, there's a very powerful argument. If you think your kid is clever enough, you don't want them to be in a school where you don't think they're going to get the best education that's going to help them the best, to provide them with an education. It leaves aside the fact that one of the biggest impacts on a child's outcomes in school is their parents, not the school itself. That has been shown in a few areas.
Oh, it's
absolutely.
It's been shown everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think. Well, the thing then is that what your man there on the train is saying isn't an unusual opinion. A lot of people,
absolutely,
who, if they're not education specialists or if they're not interested, if they're not, if you're just basically a layperson, you might think that might be the case, and a lot of people think that. And I don't think that's an unusual opinion. And it's partly what inspired the title of the blog which I write, which is called Icing on the Cake, which is my core thing which I want to get across to people and to say is that school provides the icing on the cake. But that cake is big, and the cake is the community and your parents and who's bringing you up and how you've been brought up by your peers and all the rest of it. And the icing is provided by schools on the cake there. But a lot of people do think that schools make a lot of difference, partly because that's been the political narrative for a long time, that schools make all the difference.
Well, we spend a lot of money on schools, so they better make some difference.
It's something that the government control, and the government can blame the schools. And they can blame the economic situation, but politically, blaming the parents in any way whatsoever, that's not a good thing to do. So they're not going to say to people, genuinely, it's down to you, really. They're not going to say that. And also, there's a lot of things around that, that we can talk about that. But that opinion that the guy is saying, is not unusual,
no.
and a lot of people think that. The problem with it again is that we. I think it's down to people like us who have taken an interest in these things and who are talking to, influential government people and making our voices heard to say, actually, no, come on, we have had this discussion now. We've said that we want to be an evidence-informed profession and an evidence-informed area, and we can't just go with gut feel. So therefore, let's have a look at what the evidence says, And I found a thing, just because, again, I was interested, from the Education Policy Institute, which used to be Centre Forum, which is basically a Lib Dem think tank. But they were quite interesting. There's a piece by Natalie Pereira there, and she did a bit earlier this month about conclusions from the data. And she was saying there that pupils who attend grammar schools, they don't do any better than similar pupils, so similar kinds of pupils in high-performing comprehensives. So basically, if you put all those children in Kent who end up going to those super selective or selective grammar schools, if they didn't go to grammar schools, which they don't in loads of other places, London, for example, where everybody keeps hearing about this, but other areas as well, those children do really well in those schools because they cut the cake, basically. So the kids are coming in, and you've got children coming into your school who are, who've got the smarts and the drive behind them, and people want them to succeed and so on. And they help everybody else, And the thing which the comprehensives do, which the grammar schools can't do, is that the comprehensives also help the middle attainers and the low attainers in the system generally. And the grammar schools can't do that. And actually, again, there's plenty of evidence to say that the grammar schools actually negatively affect that. Yes, children in grammar schools do well, but those children were going to do well anyway, and they get well supported elsewhere. And I think that's the key thing, which, again, I'm saying it, you probably say it, others would say it. Pretty much everybody's saying it, and all we hear against it is, oh, but I like the idea of a grammar school.
Yeah.
Well, you can't argue with people's gut feeling that way,
Absolutely.
but you can present the data to them and say and the facts and say, I can see that. And if it is just about your child, you as a parent, nobody's going to argue with you doing the best thing for your child.
No.
But if we're talking about at a government level of saying we need to support everybody's children, then surely that we have to support everybody's children. And again, government is the art of the possible and the art of the compromise. And yes, it would probably be, lovely for those top 10% kids at age 11 to put them all in in Hogwarts and send them off. But that's not.
Leave the rest of us muggles in the secondary moderns. Yeah.
As far as I gather, Peter Hitchens is pretty much right. The rest of you can go hang. I don't really care. I don't really care about you. Like, we've educated you too high anyway. There aren't jobs for you to do. So just go away, serves.
Well,
We'll leave the top end. And unfortunately, that's not a good thing.
It's not.
No, I'm afraid.
I think. Are there any other points that you'd like to make in closing? Because I think we've had a really good chat, Jack.
I think we've covered most of it. Again, I think the problem with grammar schools is that they sound appealing, and they sound appealing for so many people. I'm amazed that it's turned up as a government that they're interested in at the moment.
Yes.
And you can only assume it's either because they genuinely don't know that then the grammar schools aren't particularly sensible, or it's because people like Nick Timothy, who went to a grammar school, and Theresa May, who went to a grammar school, seem to have some kind of rosy view of education. I don't know. But no, so I would just come back to the basic view is I'd really love to find somebody, and if you can find somebody that we could hear, just tell us why we should have more grammar schools. I'd love to hear.
We will put the call out.
Fascinating.
We will put the call out. Thank you, Jack. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We will will be in touch, I'm sure, again. Just if we have any other topics that need your insightful analysis, that would be very helpful. But it's been
great. No,
a
absolutely
pleasure
lovely to
chatting
talk
to
to
you.
you. If anybody wants to have a further conversation with me, then do. I'm on Twitter at Jack_Marwood. You can find my blog, which is Icing on the Cake blog. You can look for me, and I'm sure it'll be in the show notes here.
We will put them in those show
more than
notes.
happy to have the conversation with anybody.
Okay, right. That's been brilliant. Thank you very much.